The morning of May 24, 1978 began without alarms, without riots, and without any visible sign that history was about to tilt in a grotesquely unnecessary direction. Inside a federal prison in the United States, 3 inmates stepped into the exercise yard just like hundreds of mornings before. Guards watched. Other prisoners milled around. The sky was clear. Nothing seemed unusual, except for one detail that mattered more than bars, walls, or armed towers. They were waiting for a helicopter. According to the plan, everything was already decided. In less than 30 minutes, the fences would no longer matter. The watchtowers would become irrelevant. Paperwork, sentences, and decades behind bars would dissolve into rotor noise and open air. This was not a desperate breakout driven by panic. It was something far more dangerous. Absolute confidence. Confidence built on lies that had worked before. Confidence fueled by ego, manipulation, and the belief that rules existed only for people who lacked imagination. What unfolded next did not resemble a daring escape or a clever loophole. It became a slow-motion collapse where every assumption failed, every shortcut backfired, and every person involved paid a price far greater than prison time. By the end of it all, there would be a death, a shattered family, 2 separate kidnappings, and consequences that echoed for years. And yet, the man who engineered everything would never once experience even 5 minutes of freedom. This story is often labeled the dumbest prison escape of all time. But that description misses the deeper truth, because stupidity was not the real engine here. Ego was. So was the illusion of control. This was not a tale about bad luck or bad timing. It was about how charisma without conscience turns people into tools, how confidence replaces caution, and how intelligence, when detached from reality, becomes self-destructive. The most disturbing question is not how the escape failed, but why so many people believed it could work at all. To understand that, the story must begin long before the helicopter blades ever touch the air. It begins with one man, a lifetime of deception, and a system he believed he could always outsmart. And from there, everything started to unravel. Long before helicopters, hostages, or prison yards entered the picture, everything revolved around Garrett Trapnell and a belief system that had shaped his entire adult life. Trapnell did not see laws as boundaries. He saw them as suggestions, obstacles designed for people who lacked confidence, nerve, or the ability to talk their way out of consequences. From an early age, deception was not a tactic for him. It was an identity. Over the course of his criminal career, Trapnell was arrested more than 20 times, often under different names, different professions, and different personal histories. He claimed to be businessmen, government operatives, even a fake intelligence agent, crafting personas with the ease of changing clothes. His crimes were varied but consistent in spirit. Fraud schemes, bank-related crimes, high-value theft, and elaborate lies designed to impress, intimidate, or confuse whoever stood in front of him. At one point, he even claimed connections to international arms deals, projecting an image of importance that existed only in his own storytelling. What made Trapnell uniquely dangerous was not violence, but manipulation. In courtrooms, he rarely fought the evidence. Instead, he performed. He leaned heavily on claims of mental illness, presenting himself as unstable, misunderstood, or psychologically fractured. Time and again, this strategy worked. Judges and juries hesitated. Sentences were softened. Prison time was replaced with psychiatric evaluations. Despite the length of his criminal record, Trapnell spent less than 2 total years behind bars across decades of offenses. Each success reinforced the same conclusion in his mind. The system was weak, and he was smarter than everyone inside it. That illusion finally cracked in the early 1970s. After a highly publicized crime involving a commercial aircraft hijacking, authorities could no longer justify leniency. The performance no longer outweighed the risk. In 1973, Trapnell was sentenced to life in federal prison. For the first time, talking had failed him. The doors closed, the routines began, and the audience he had always relied on disappeared. But prison did not humble Trapnell. It only changed the environment. Stripped of freedom, he redirected his skills inward, toward fellow inmates, guards, outsiders, and anyone willing to listen. He studied people the way others study locks. He observed weakness, loneliness, admiration, and ambition. Where others saw concrete and steel, Trapnell saw human leverage. Most inmates count time in days and years. Trapnell counted opportunities. Prison, to him, was not an ending. It was a waiting room. And he was convinced that eventually, someone desperate enough, fascinated enough, or broken enough would walk through the door. That person would arrive sooner than anyone expected. And when she did, Trapnell would believe his escape was no longer a question of if, but when. By the time Garrett Trapnell was adjusting to life behind bars, the United States was living through a period that would later be remembered as one of the most vulnerable eras in aviation history. In the late 1960s and early 1970s, airport security was minimal, passenger screening was inconsistent, and commercial flights had quietly become stages for criminal spectacle. Aircraft were hijacked with disturbing regularity, often for ransom, political statements, or nothing more than attention. In that environment, notoriety spread faster than fear. One name hovered over that era like a myth: D.B. Cooper. The man who parachuted from a plane with $200,000 in cash and vanished without a trace became less a criminal and more a legend. His disappearance planted a dangerous idea in the minds of others. If one man could humiliate the system and disappear into history, then surely it could be done again. What that myth concealed was the role of luck, timing, and factors no imitator could replicate. One of those imitators was Martin McNally, a former paratrooper who believed discipline and courage were enough to guarantee success. In 1972, McNally attempted to write his own version of the Cooper story. He hijacked a commercial flight, demanded $500,000, and planned to escape midair using a parachute. On paper, the plan echoed the legend. In reality, it collapsed under a single miscalculation: weight. The cash alone weighed nearly 60 kilograms, far more than expected. When McNally jumped, the money slipped from his grasp and disappeared into the darkness below. There was no mystery afterward, no nationwide manhunt, no legend. Within days, investigators traced him through fingerprints, connecting evidence to his military records. McNally was arrested and sentenced, stripped of the fantasy that had driven him. The myth of Cooper had promised escape. Reality delivered a prison cell. Fate placed McNally in the same federal prison as Trapnell. What followed was not coincidence, but chemistry. Two men, each convinced they had been one mistake away from success, found validation in each other's failures. They did not bond over regret. They bonded over resentment. In long conversations, they reconstructed their pasts, reframed losses as near victories, and fed each other the most dangerous belief of all: that the system had beaten them unfairly. Inside prison walls, stories gain power. Failures soften with repetition. Blame shifts outward. Together, Trapnell and McNally formed an agreement built on shared ego rather than strategy. If one of them ever escaped, the other would not be left behind. It was a promise rooted in fantasy, not logistics, but both men treated it as inevitable. What neither of them understood was that every failed escape leaves behind evidence, patterns, and watchful eyes. And while they obsessed over aircraft, money, and headlines, the real opening would come from somewhere far quieter, far more personal, and far more destructive than either of them anticipated. That opening would not arrive through force. It would arrive through belief. The turning point in this story did not come from within the prison walls. It came from the outside, quietly, through paper and ink, carried by ordinary mail. Barbara Oswald was not a criminal, not an extremist, and not someone seeking notoriety. She was a single mother, living in a suburb outside St. Louis, trying to rebuild a sense of purpose after personal loss and professional disappointment. Following a serious accident, she had stepped away from her previous career and immersed herself in psychology and criminal justice, drawn especially to the idea of rehabilitation and second chances. That mindset made her vulnerable in a very specific way. When she came across a book detailing the life of Garrett Trapnell, she did not read it as a warning. She read it as a case study. Page after page described a man who appeared intelligent, misunderstood, and perpetually mistreated by the system. What the book presented as manipulation, Barbara interpreted as complexity. What others saw as pathology, she saw as depth. The most dangerous transformation happened quietly. Curiosity turned into empathy, and empathy drifted into fascination. The book contained Trapnell's prison mailing address, printed for readers who wished to write to him. Barbara did. At first, the letters were careful, analytical, and distant. Trapnell responded exactly as someone with decades of experience in persuasion would. He mirrored her language. He validated her interests. He positioned himself not as a predator, but as a man finally understood. Over time, the tone changed. The letters grew longer, warmer, and increasingly personal. What began as correspondence turned into emotional dependence. Trapnell promised a future that existed only in words. He spoke of starting over, of escaping the toxicity of America, of building a peaceful life abroad. He sent images of a supposed property in Australia, painting a picture of freedom, land, and reinvention. None of it was real, but reality mattered less than repetition. With each letter, Barbara invested more emotionally, until doubt became painful and belief felt necessary. She began visiting the prison regularly. Eventually, she brought her teenage daughter, introducing Trapnell into her family sphere. Boundaries dissolved. What should have been an abstract relationship became physical presence, eye contact, routine. Trapnell did not pressure her with demands. He let the idea form in her own mind. He framed escape not as crime, but as correction. Not as danger, but as destiny. He positioned himself as someone who had been failed by institutions and deserved rescue. From Trapnell's perspective, this was not love, it was leverage. Prison had stripped him of mobility, but not of influence. Barbara represented something he had been waiting for. Access without suspicion, belief without skepticism, and commitment without calculation. He spoke carefully, always emphasizing inevitability. Not if he would be free, but when. What Barbara did not understand was that Trapnell had rehearsed this dynamic before. He knew how quickly admiration could become obedience, and how easily devotion could be reframed as sacrifice. By the time the idea of a helicopter entered the conversation, it did not feel radical to her. It felt logical, necessary, even noble. This was the moment the escape truly began, not in the prison yard, but in the mind of someone who believed she was helping, when in reality she was being used. By the morning of May 24, 1978, the plan had been repeated so many times in conversation that it felt inevitable. Inside the prison, 3 inmates positioned themselves in the yard during routine movement, scanning the sky as if timing alone could bend reality. Outside, Barbara Oswald was already committed past the point of hesitation. She had rented a helicopter under a harmless pretext. carrying hand-drawn sketches of the prison layout and 2 concealed firearms. There were no ropes, no harnesses, no contingency routes. The plan depended entirely on one fragile assumption: that confidence could substitute for logistics. Minutes after takeoff, Barbara revealed the weapon and redirected the flight toward the prison. The pilot was not an inexperienced civilian. He was Alan Barklage, a combat veteran who understood airframes, risk envelopes, and what happens when aircraft enter kill zones. As the prison came into view, the reality below was unmistakable. Guard towers, drawn rifles, and clear lines of fire surrounded the yard. Any attempt to land would invite immediate gunfire. Any low hover would risk catastrophic collision with walls and roofs. Inside the yard, the inmates improvised. They climbed onto a small overhang, waving clothing and flailing their arms to draw attention, assuming the helicopter would simply drift close enough to grab. It never did. The physics were unforgiving. Without equipment, without clearance, and under armed observation, there was no safe approach. What the inmates interpreted as hesitation was, in fact, survival judgment from the cockpit. As the helicopter hovered, tension spiked. Barklage recognized the moment the operation crossed from coercion into inevitability. He suggested opening the cabin doors mid-air, claiming it would save time and reduce suspicion. When Barbara leaned away to comply, he seized the opening. A violent struggle erupted in a confined space, controls momentarily unattended. The aircraft lurched and yawed, its stability compromised, the ground rushing closer in uneven bursts. In the chaos, Barklage managed to disarm her. Confronted with the loss of control she believed she held, Barbara reached again, insisting she had another weapon. With no margin left and no safe alternatives, Barklage fired. One shot struck with fatal consequence. The helicopter, now uncontrolled, descended hard but intact, touching down roughly 70 meters from the prison perimeter. The rotors slowed. Silence followed. Below, the inmates froze. The performance ended instantly. Guards converged. Barklage ran toward them, shouting that he had been kidnapped. Within moments, the narrative collapsed into clarity. There would be no extraction, no sprint to freedom, no dramatic departure. The escape had failed not because of bad luck, but because it had never been viable. Investigators reconstructed the sequence quickly. The lack of equipment, the exposed approach, the visible guard response, the absence of any landing plan. Every detail pointed to recklessness masquerading as certainty. For the inmates, consequences were immediate. Charges, isolation, and the permanent loss of credibility. For Barbara, the cost was irreversible. What remained was the most uncomfortable truth of all. The architect of the plan had not been in the helicopter. He had not faced the rifles. He had not wrestled for control at altitude. He had watched from behind walls, confident that someone else would absorb the risk. And even after this failure, after a death, after public scrutiny, after the certainty of harsher confinement, the manipulation did not stop. It only changed form. The helicopter crash did not end the story. It only stripped away the illusion that freedom could be stolen by force. Inside prison walls, Garrett Trapnell adjusted immediately. Where most people would have collapsed under the weight of failure, he recalibrated. The plan had cost a life, drawn national attention, and guaranteed that he would never leave prison alive. But control, for Trapnell, had never depended on movement. It depended on access. Facing trial for his role in the failed escape, Trapnell made a calculated decision. He chose to represent himself. This was not bravado, it was strategy. Acting as his own attorney granted him privileges most inmates never receive: meetings with witnesses, access to evidence, and supervised conversations outside standard visitation rules. The courtroom became his new stage, and once again, he knew exactly how to perform. Among those he requested to speak with was Robin Oswald, the teenage daughter left behind after her mother's death. At 17 years old, Robin was grieving, isolated, and desperate for stability. Trapnell understood this dynamic instantly. He did not blame her mother. He framed the tragedy as unavoidable, the result of forces beyond anyone's control. Slowly, he positioned himself not as the cause of her loss, but as the only person who truly understood it. He promised protection. He promised guidance. He promised a future filled with horses, cars, and financial security. Every promise was conditional, quietly anchored to a single prerequisite: his freedom. To Robin, this did not feel like manipulation. It felt like loyalty. After months of controlled conversations and emotional reinforcement, Trapnell introduced the next step. On December 21, 1978, Robin boarded a commercial flight traveling between Louisville and Kansas City. The aircraft carried ordinary passengers expecting an ordinary landing. Minutes before descent, Robin handed a flight attendant a handwritten note. It claimed she was wearing an explosive device and demanded that the plane be diverted to a small airport near the prison holding Trapnell. The message was calm, polite, almost apologetic. What followed exposed how fragile the plan truly was. Robin delayed her announcement until late in the flight, eliminating surprise. She allowed passengers to leave. She requested sandwiches, milk, and coffee, speaking gently to crew and hostages alike. Over time, the cabin emptied. Authorities negotiated for nearly 10 hours, watching as fear slowly gave way to exhaustion and confusion. Eventually, Robin surrendered peacefully. The supposed bomb was revealed to be a fake device, constructed from flares and wiring. No one was injured, no demands were met. Trapnell was never brought to the airport. Once again, the escape failed before it began. This final attempt revealed the pattern with brutal clarity. Trapnell never risked his own body. Others absorbed the danger, the guilt, and the consequences. His co-conspirators ended up dead, imprisoned, or traumatized, while he remained exactly where he started, behind bars, untouched by the physical cost of his schemes. The courts responded decisively. Additional charges ensured multiple life sentences. Trapnell was placed in long-term solitary confinement, cut off from communication, stripped of influence. He would spend the remainder of his life alone, dying in 1993 at the age of 55, having never once stepped outside prison walls after his sentencing. The escapes were called foolish. The plans were called incompetent. But the most unsettling truth lingered beneath those labels. The danger was never the helicopter, the plane, or the explosives. The danger was a man who understood people better than systems, and used that knowledge until nothing was left to take. In the end, Garrett Trapnell never escaped a single locked gate. Not once. Despite multiple plans, years of manipulation, and an unwavering belief in his own superiority, he never experienced even 5 minutes of freedom outside prison walls. The irony is unavoidable. A man obsessed with control spent the final years of his life in solitary confinement, cut off from the very human connections he once weaponized so effectively. History often remembers stories like this as comedy, branding them as the dumbest escape attempts, and moving on. But laughter is a shallow response to a much darker reality. This was not a failure caused by bad timing or technical mistakes. It was the predictable outcome of ego unchecked by consequence, of intelligence divorced from responsibility. Every plan Trapnell designed relied on the same assumption: that someone else would absorb the risk, the danger, and the fallout while he reaped the reward. The real cost was not measured in years added to a sentence. It was measured in a lost life, a destroyed family, and a teenager coerced into committing a crime she did not fully understand. The system did not fail to stop Trapnell. People failed to recognize how dangerous charisma can be when it is mistaken for insight, empathy, or brilliance. So, the question that lingers is not whether this was the dumbest prison escape of all time. The more uncomfortable question is this: how often do we confuse confidence with competence and storytelling with truth? How many disasters begin not with force, but with persuasion? Trapnell died in 1993, at 55 years old, alone, imprisoned, and remembered not as a mastermind, but as a warning. A reminder that intelligence without restraint does not create freedom. It creates wreckage. And sometimes, the most complete prison is the one a person builds inside their own certainty.